Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I welcome you again, my dear students, in this another very important talk on approaches and methods in English language teaching. Uh, as you remember, we already had some discussion, a very extensive discussion on these approaches and methods of English language teaching in the first few weeks of January 2020. However, because of this span of 5-6 months have broken us apart, and then we've been under great sort of a situation that was a kind of a medical condition. We are back to our classrooms now, so I thought it to have a bit of a review of what we already had done, so that we could connect the coming very important lectures on teaching of listening and speaking, reading, writing, etc. in the coming days. So in order to provide you the theoretical foundations and the understanding of methods and their roles in the teaching of English language teaching, we had this class that we conducted, and I'm going to repeat it for all of you and for many other viewers around the world who have joined us from different countries. So I hope that this talk is going to be useful to everybody, every student of English language. I must say it could be a class BS1 student, BS2, 3, 4, or he could be any student of any department. If he's interested in learning English language development skills, if he really wants to know about the English language teaching and use, it is interested for him to join us on YouTube and subscribe this channel, and then be part of our future lectures and learning process. So today we are going to start with the topic that is approaches and methods in English language teaching. You know, you would ask questions, sir, why is it important for a teacher to realize and begin to understand the methods and why they are necessary? I would have only very brief answer. You know, for doing anything, there is always a procedure. For writing a book, for writing a small note, for giving any talk, for attending any party, for attending any meeting, for doing anything, there is always a procedure. Even if you go and to sit on a dining table, you will have a procedure to follow it. So English language is such a interesting and an exciting learning process that it can give you very wonderful results. If you follow a particular process and a particular method, then you will see the results are far more amazing than you can think. So these methods give you the orientation of how languages were taught, learned, and what were their problems and what were their merits, advantages or disadvantages, and which method is good and how it is good, and which is not good and how it is not good. So you being teachers of English language teaching tomorrow can have a very good understanding of what to choose and what not to choose. Otherwise, you know, there are critics, there are scholars, there are linguists who for last 10 years or 20 years begin to say that we live in a post-method era and why there is need of learning more methods anymore. That's very true. And that's a very interesting concern also. But you see, after this post-method era, we could not completely eliminate the importance of methods. I mean, in post-method era, we saw that the languages have been taught and learned around the world, but the teachers have again, and the researchers have again felt the need of an innovative and important procedure of taking the materials to the classroom. So, and this is how the importance and the need of methods become completely indispensable to all of us. So, my dear students, let's see briefly. We'll be trying to briefly go through these methods because we have already done this discussion, but we want to just refresh ourselves. So here we have got the discussion that we did in the classes, and I gave you some handouts, but I have done a bit of an changes into this. So this is what actually is our main topic today. Yes, this is how we begin. The first thing, if you remember, is this: explore your beliefs and values. Explore your beliefs and values as a language teacher or a learner. Now, this is very important. If you remember, I always say it to all of you in the classes that one of the problems that our teachers or our English language teaching education in Pakistan is that we have a wrong belief system for language learning and teaching. And that belief system acts as an hindrance. So what I would say that uh, all of you must look into your practice. I mean, your belief as a teacher or a learner. How and what is the nature of language? How could that be learned simply? Then what are the beliefs of others, and what is your belief? Was the belief of your teacher? Then you look into the teaching methods that we have over last almost 100 years, and then we'll try to relate them to our teaching and learning context. So I mean, this is that we already have done the discussion, and then I repeat simply because these things are very important to begin with, that you have a belief system. Every teacher, every learner must have a belief for learning a language, for teaching a language. How is his approach going to be important and decisive in the teaching of language or in the learning of language? That is very, very important. So this is the discussion that we did in the class. That's why I have now, if you see here, uh, I still see people are coming in, so are causing some disturbance. So, dear students, now these are the 3-4 technical terms that as an English language teacher or maybe the teaching or maybe a student of English language teaching classes or TESOL classes, the first terms that a teacher encounter with in his professional life, that is his approach, his method, his technique, and his understanding of the term methodology. How would you define them? Can somebody come up with, give me a very quick answer to the first question? Term like approach, method, technique, and methodology. Can somebody say something very quickly? Are you hearing me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, very quickly if you want to say something on these terms. Or can you tell me very briefly who is the person who actually conceptualized these terms first?
Sorry, sir, I'm not aware of that.
Okay.
Sir.
Okay, so here we got this gentleman, Anthony, in 63, and Brown, 2002, came up with this idea about these terms. Now, very briefly, the word approach basically is very much the very fundamental thing to begin with. And what is an approach? It is always based on the assumptions of a teacher or any learner of language. Your assumptions, your hypotheses, your ideas, I mean, your instinctive affiliation to the language. How do you believe in it? So about the nature of language, learning and teaching. That's the first starting point. If you think language is a very complex process, if you think language is something heavenly, if you think language is something that can only be learned by joining Oxford University, or something that is full of grammatical rules and structures and it needs a lot of books on skills on many other things, if you draw such kind of a complicated picture, it's all up to you. if you think it is a simple process of learning, like you learned your first language, like other people's learn languages, it is just getting an idea, or it is just getting exposed to a range of words and then using them in a particular situation. Yes, and more importantly, if you consider language is learning is the name of a behavior, you see that how words behave in a particular situation. Well, it is all up to you, your own belief system that you form. Then you come to the other word, that's method. Now, this is the overall plan for systematic presentation of language based on a selected approach. Now, you've chosen the approach, whatever approach, you have got cognitive approach, you've got structural, you've got, language acquisition based approach, or you've got more nature, nurture sort of thing, then you accordingly design your method. The other term is technique. Well, that's very critical in our context of this country. Specific classroom activities. These are basically considered as specific classroom activities which are consistent with the method and in harmony with that approach. So every approach has its own method and its own course of activities and procedures to be taken out into the classroom. As you remember, we analyzed a lot of question papers in different exams in the classes. So we wanted to see how people test language, and then by these questions, we could find the approach of teaching of those teachers in particular contexts. So there is another word like the difference between method and methodology. Sometimes people, confuse both of them. When we talk about a method, it is just a prescription for how language can be best taught and learned. I mean, this is described, you can find it on a piece of paper that a particular method follows this, a particular method follows this, begins with, ends with this, and then concludes with many other handouts and reinforcement exercises or etc. But that's the prescription part of it. But when you talk about methodology, it is something that exactly when the teacher goes out in the class and he begins to do it. So what practicing pedagogy, practicing teachers actually do in the classroom to achieve their stated or unstated objectives. So what he actually begins to do in the class, his doing part, his practical part, his pedagogical part is known as his methodology. Otherwise, if you describe something as a prescription, it will just be known as a method. So, I mean, methodology is an extended version of the word method, and everybody can just then see in the class how a teacher performs that. Now we got the 20th century. Search for the best method. So in 20th century, these methods were basically, the products of their social and political contexts. Like we talked about audio-lingual method, or we talked about grammar translation method. We talked about some other methods. They've got a very interesting history. So, but the current realization is that there is no best method, and we may be in a post-method period. But methods are still valuable in that teachers can select from them in accordance with their sense of plausibility. What do you imagine now? Teaching was like in the first half of the 20th century, what methods were used? Now, this is a brief description of that. I'm just trying to put it in that way that we see 1950s to 1900 to 1950s. In these 50 years, We have a lot of focus on this grammar translation method in the center. We have some uh, uh, something on audio-lingual also, which was applied more or less with the army people who were detectives mostly going into different countries doing particular assignments. So it is an audio-lingual sort of thing, and then we'll read in detail, we'll study in details in other slides on this. So grammar translation method, audio-lingual method, and then other oral approach. Because this was also audio-lingual method was also a kind of oral approach, which later on led to the development of direct method. So if we see exactly after grammar translation method, which is popularity, then its problems that it finally exposed to the world. There was a great resistance that it was not achieving the desired goals. Hence, there was a beginning of some more practical, functional, and I should say natural, somewhat close to natural methods, and that was direct method. So we see this in 1950s, and then 1960s and 70s, we see this audio-lingualism continues. Transformative grammar was at that time considered to be not that relevant to teaching, which had this idea of a lead also with it. But at that time, there was a lot of criticism on it, that this method is not going to be, this method is going to push us back to the grammar translation world. So it was not very much accepted and considered relevant. So in 1970s, then we see the emergence of Stephen Krashen's concept of second language acquisition as a main field of inquiry and research and practical knowledge in English language teaching world. So we saw a lot of people talking about the Stephen the hypothesis, the SLA hypothesis, which gradually became very popular with Stephen Krashen. Then we saw uh, here is the grammar translation method. We got a very brief description of that. We already had done this description. I'm repeating it again and again, just for your knowledge. Now, what was this grammar translation method? Now, I said very easy to understand. Well, this was a method of teaching in which grammar and translation were something that was in focus. You see, people ask you question, what is a grammar translation method? You can simply answer it. It's the method of teaching English language which focuses on the rules of grammar and learning language through translation. So you all are, rather we all in this part of the country, maybe in Pakistan is a country that is one of the widely using country that uses this methodology in its English language teaching programs. So the goal is to read literature or develop intellectual ability. Grammar rules are analyzed and memorized. Grammar is taught deductively, which is only rules. Translation is the main technique. The L1, which is your mother tongue, is the medium of instruction. Reading and writing are the main focus. Accuracy is very important, then is more important than fluency. And then you see teacher's role is authoritarian and rigid. That's very important. How the teachers actually have been in our history looking at language learners and the text and the classroom environment. So if the teacher's role is of that greater authority, it is very embarrassing at times. Many of the students who are with weak ability or with hesitations, they are always blocked by such environment where the teacher is an authority, where the teacher has this great impact on the learners. And the student's role, you see, is only lethargic, passive. He's sitting and he's listening, like you. Most of the cases you also have experienced that how what the teachers actually does in their classrooms. Now, as I said you last time also, this is one of the great reasons in a English language system, English language teaching system in Pakistan, that we have not realized the true ideals of language teaching. That language has a social, academic, and a cultural importance. A language is not necessarily to be only part of the classroom life. Language should not be restricted. Language learning should not be restricted to a classroom. It must be taken out of the classroom. So the focus should not be just knowing the language, but on the use of language. And I tell you that this methodology, which was which more or less belongs to the cognitive theory of learning that we discussed yesterday, uh, highly promotes the kind of a scholarship in English language learning and teaching. And that scholarship is just getting the knowledge of language, but not getting the command on the use of language. So we've got two streams. One is the use of language, the other is the knowledge of language. Yes, you've got the knowledge of language, but you see many of our teachers who are very good in grammar translation method, who teach the entire grammar books to the students. They can do anything. They can, rephrase. They can make anything in the grammatical structures in the syntactic organization, but cannot speak few sentences and cannot write that fluently good English. That simply is because of the belief system, because of the training, because of the restrictions and the disadvantages of living and teaching the system that I call, the method that I call is grammar translation method. That unfortunately in our history has been a great impediment. Yes, some outstanding students, some who are very good students could take some benefit of it. But otherwise, majority of learners in this country, if they have failed to grow in English language skills, in my opinion, that simply is because our teachers were following this method. Teachers themselves were not that good in English language communication skills. So consequently, the wrong approaches, the wrong belief system has finally taken us to a place where our students, they, they, take, they take their degrees, but are not sufficiently strong enough to communicate in daily life situations. That is where we find a revolt globally coming against grammar translation method. So we see that was the emergence of direct method. Now here, what actually few characteristics of this method were that the goal of this language learning method was this time to communicate. Now this is getting closer to CLT, which is communicative language teaching, which we discuss later in this session. The goal of language teaching is to communicate. Now we had just here, you realize that the method that was very popular all over the world at that time, and people were looking for the knowledge of language, not for the use of language. Even at that time, we had got no concept of technology. We do not have that concept of globalization. We had no idea that English language is going to be the global language and it's going to be the language of trade, commerce, and everything, or international medium of instruction or something more than that. So people were just looking for knowledge. But once it was realized that no, it is not the case, it is going to be the language of international communication and globalization. So we had this true and the real picture of language teaching coming up. And then this time the focus was given to the communicative properties of language. That language should be taught to communicate with others. But what was here, very interestingly, this methodology talked about no use of first language in the classroom. So L1 was banned in the classroom. Grammar was taught inductively, I mean through use, not directly, but there were passages of text first exposed and the rules were analyzed. Question and answer exercises are main techniques here. Speaking is prioritized, supported by other skills. Accuracy was also very important. With a focus on self-correction teachers to demonstrate, act, ask questions, correct mistakes, and make their own lesson plans. Now, this picture, as we have just described, was comparatively better. But again, what was most devastating here was the ban on the use of first language. Now, you would wonder that this methodology has worked very efficiently and very effectively and got a very wide acceptance in urban areas, but in the remote areas of Pakistan, in the rural areas of our country, in the province of Sindh, this could not be implemented because on the one hand, there were pedagogical challenges that the teachers themselves were not equipped with the communication skills, although they had introduced the entire teaching program, which was in English medium, and they used to call themselves that English medium schools. Even you can have now a big number of English language medium schools, but I would say that their condition is very pseudo, and they are not that real English medium schools. And on the other end, all the books were in English. So this mess, I should say, on the part of our education policy created a lot of confusion. I mean, and for the teachers on the one hand, for the students and parents on the other hand. So I mean, in a country like Pakistan, this again turned out to be a big mess. I should say a failure. Uh, but only in the remote areas, in the rural areas, not in the urban areas. I must say, in urban areas, well, English medium schools that ban first language in the class, you've got a lot of examples of like Karachi Grammar School, St. Michael School, cadet colleges, and some other colleges you would see uh, that followed English medium instruction. You find the students of class 5 speaking so good English, writing and using English that extensively and that widely and that convincingly that our graduates cannot. So our problems were, uh, deeply rooted in the context then. It was not partly the method that was bad, but partly because the context that it was put in was not fitting there, and our teachers and our students, our classrooms were really not ready to have the true benefits of this method, and this is how it continued. Parallel to this, we found audiolingualism. Now, this was a very different approach. Like this talked about language, just learning in the language through structures, sounds, and words to be learned, memorized. Language learning seen as a mechanical process, just habit formation. I mean, you do one thing and you let others do something, repeat it. Somebody is, uh, you know, if using the word, may I come in, sir, then he'll have to go out and enter the room and say, may I come in, sir. Somebody wants to show you the word drinking, he'll have to take a glass of water and begin to drink, and then let others realize that how the word drink can be used and in what condition it can be used. So typical classroom activities like drills, pattern practices, and dialogues were the key techniques in this methodology or in this practice of teaching language. And speaking was the main focus, and the first skill learned with the oral communication being its goal. Language items are not necessarily contextualized. Now, you see, that is the problem. If you do not contextualize language teaching, you cannot be friendly with it. You will never be able to grow that confidence and that strength which you can feel once you use it into a context. So, I mean, this is how these methods or these practices just ended as soon as they began. Now here we are in almost in 1970s to 80s. What do you think was the next big thing to come in the English language teaching history, English language teaching world? Now, the next big thing to come in this timeline was the functional notional syllabuses and the rise of technology, the PPT concept, presentation, practice, and production. So With this lot of discussion, debate, and research coming in 1980s, we have language labs, giving you the practical orientation of language, the use of language, uh, and then we have other syllabuses that talked about the communicative properties of language. So, and then we have teachers that were made to present, practice, and produce in the classes. So what they will not only present, not only use the entire time of the class, but they would have some time of the class for their presentation, for their teaching. Then there was a kind of a practice of those exercises, and then the students were made to work in groups and produce that language in the form of activities that also we'll be trying to do if we got this opportunity of meeting again, or other activities like group discussions, pair work, group work, and some other thing as possible in an ideal face-to-face learning environment. So this time, then we have some other methods also that arised that were in practice at that time in the English language teaching world. And if you see the approaches and methods book, it will tell you about these methods that came for a very short period of time, followed by certain approaches of psycholinguists or people who were very familiar in psychology. For example, they talked about this method. I mean, this was an issue, and this was a challenge for the global community to realize how quick, how fast, how efficiently can one learn any foreign language. And in this case, it was English. So the silent way was another very important method of teaching English language. Now, interestingly, what it required? It required that the teacher be silent. So if the teacher is occupying less time in class and giving more time to the students, and he's using colors, charts, and other techniques, sticks, and other instruments or aids in the classes, the students will be fascinated and they will be compelled to use that language. So that was also in practice for some time in some countries, like in East European countries and East Asian countries also, the silent way. I mean, teacher with less role in the class and the students with more role in the class. That is the basic premise in this method. Now, TPR. Now, this TPR, very commonly known like total physical response, is a language teaching method that was built around the coordination of speech and action. It attempts to teach language through physical activity. Now, you would be surprised that speech and action. So as I said earlier also, you got to have something to speak and then act accordingly. Well, if you are using a word like writing, so what writing a letter, I want to write a letter. So you are going to then do it. Then you will say, I have written a letter. I write a letter, I am writing a letter, I have written a letter. So, I mean, you need to do these things. This is a kind of a habit formation also. I mean, every language, speech act which was performed, it was performed by action. But then again, it did not gain that wide acceptance and popularity and nothing, and it went in history. Then another term that comes in the history of English language teaching is suggestopedia. Now, this was Bulgarian educator Lezenov who talked about this concept of language teaching, and it made the use of language of dialogue, situations, and translations to present and practice language. And in particular, it made the use of music, visual images, and relaxation exercises to make learning more comfortable, subtractive bilingual education, and effective Suggestopedia is said to be a pedagogical application of suggestology, that is the influence of suggestion on human behavior. Now, this method, uh, I'm again and again being interrupted by people who are just coming to join in. So I would like all of you to join us before 11 o'clock so that we could not feel these distractions. So Suggestopedia actually was, sort of a community based language learning where, you have a very comfortable environment. Yes, Sumaira, you want to say something? Hello? Oh, somebody is trying to say something. Okay. When you're trying to say something, probably you click on the button and then it shows me here that somebody has raised the hand. So this is all about Suggestopedia, but this method also could not gain popularity and did not get that acceptance around the world. But it exists to be a language teaching method in our history that focuses on the use of dialogues, situations, and translation to develop the target language of the students, using first-time music as a source of language learning, and using images, pictures, and other kind of exercises to make the learners more comfortable and taking them out of the fear of learning a target language, but that it could not get the desired goals. Then is, after all these discussions, we have got this concept of communicative language teaching. Now, this is where we saw all the previous methods had a kind of a reflection in this approach. This was basically and very widely termed as communicative language approach. We call it communicative language teaching also, but basically it was given by Littlewood, Brumfitt, and Keith Morrow and Keith Johnson. They came up to give more focus to the communicative properties of language, and we found that language began for the first time to get its functional and its communicative dimensions are coming under the focus of teachers. So what happens in this language teaching practice is that meaning is more important. I mean, as I said in the beginning, whatever you say, it must mean something. If it's able to communicate the meaning, yes, well, it is acceptable. Dialogues, if you center around communicative functions and are not normally memorized. Contextualization, for the first time in the history of English language teaching, becomes the very foundation for learning this language. I mean, you can never learn a language without contextualizing it. Language learning is learning to communicate through listening, speaking, and through reading, writing. Comprehensible pronunciation is sought. I mean, something not exactly with the standard RP English, British English, but something that comes close to it, something that makes meaning clear, something that is intelligible, something that is comprehensible, could be accepted in this from the students. Attempts to communicate may be encouraged from the very beginning. Judicious use of native language is accepted where feasible. So, I mean, people could use language, no strict ban on it. So if somebody is not able to speak, he can speak and express it in his target language, in his Sindhi language, Urdu language. Many times, if you remember, we as the teachers of English, once come to the classrooms, we at times explain some concepts in Sindhi and Urdu. So this was a very good, and a very convenient dimension or feature of this method, that you can use it, but justly, not all the times. Translation may be used where students need or benefit from it. Reading and writing can start from the first day if desired. I mean, if the students are comfortable, you can just start reading and writing from the very first day of your class. Communicative competence is the goal. Now look at this. communicative competence. Now, all other methods that we have discussed now were more focused on the linguistic competence rather than the communicative competence. This was the concept given by Bombay, and his concept was again this, that language teaching or language learning centers around two levels of competence. One, that is linguistic competence, other is the communicative competence. Now, the students in our program of linguistics should be ready to experience this. I mean, they have to prove that they are linguistically competent as well as they are communicatively competent. And our students who are taking literature courses, literature programs, for them, it's very important to be competent communicatively. So not linguistically, necessarily linguistically, as long as linguistics is not their main uh, uh, or main specialization, they can stick to the literature specialization, but communicative competence is something that is mandatory for all the groups that learn English language or literature. So the parallel competence is the linguistic competence. Fluency is important. Now look at this. This is a kind of approach which rejects the idea partly of accuracy. Now we have a debate between the English language teaching world, between the English language learning world. You see, from class 6 or the first class that you learned English, I learned English, all of us learned English. We always had a kind of fear that our teachers would mind if we made mistakes. So accuracy was given a lot of importance, not the fluency. Whereas if you see L1 models, SLA philosophy, SLA theory of learning, or all the Christian's hypothesis, all the other, even the Plato's concept of language, the nature versus nurture principle, they also believe that, you know, language should begin to flow. You must come up to speak English or any target language, then the accuracy part, the correction part will be, you know, responded gradually, and it comes gradually that you can speak English not only fluently but also correctly. But you must not be blocked by the fear of accuracy, and that has happened, unfortunately, in our English language history, and that's why we see and face the situation that we have now. And interestingly, in this particular method of teaching language, the role of a teacher is of a manager. I mean, he's not an authority, he's not a heavenly creature, he's just a manager, a counselor, and a guide. Look at the levels and the status that we give teacher. We in this country, we think that everything that comes from teacher is correct. Everything that he says is revered. Everything he says is perfectly fine. We cannot argue with the teacher. We cannot debate with teacher. These are very false, very orthodoxic, very traditional notions. You know, teacher is just your helping hand. If you go into any Western country, United States and UK, you know, the teachers never assert themselves as authority. They're always trying to be helping hand. They always try to be equal with you. They always, you know, feel a kind of a close intimacy with their students. And they try to prove with their behavior that they are not strangers, they are not heavenly creature, they are not something supreme, something that should be, you know, bowed down before. So as a good teacher, you need to make your student realize that you are there to help them out, to hold their finger, walk through the process of learning. So this methodology was the first time in 1980s talked about, and then also in 1980s in the East Asian countries, and in 1990s into the Asian countries, and also in many of the European countries, particularly Eastern European countries, very, very popular. And still we see that the Oxford English Language Teaching Research Journal would publish a lot of research articles on the importance of communicative language teaching. So this is where the world, the teaching, English language teaching world basically ended. So this is where also we begin to see that yes, now we have end of these methodology. Now there was another phrase like context-based learning, but this context-based learning uh, also was a kind of eclectic sort of learning where all methods were one or the other way were just put in. But then gradually the scholars, the linguists, the teaching and research community come up to largely believe in one thing, that was that we are in post-method era. But as I speak to you today, in this post-COVID-19 situation, in this post-COVID-19 world, there are voices coming from English language teaching world that now we need to return to the methods. Now we need to return to new methods of teaching language and learning, because the world is completely changed now for all of us. We'll have to look back to this. New methodologies need to be explored and new ways of learning need to be explored. Then in this slide, you would see some examples uh, of these all methodologies that I was talking to you about. Now here, for example, I have given all these handouts to you right in the classes, but I'm just making them here available and visible to many other our viewers and people who are watching our channel on YouTube for their information also. That these are few examples of every method. For example, if I say translate the following into English, you can imagine which method does it represent. Or if there is a question coming like take the ID card of your friend and write a paragraph. Now this is a very contextualized question. Or you got another question like do as directed. You got the grammar structures to work with. Or you got another question uh, like uh, there is a picture given to you, study the details and describe it to your friends. So, I mean, these questions are some of the examples of some of these methods that were in practice for last many years. And we already have done the practical exercises on that part. But if anybody is interested, you can see the detailed handouts in that. With that, we come up to the last slide, which is that we have discussed about these. I would like you to focus on the first three methods and then also on communicative language teaching. But then I would like you to read these articles and books like 40 Years of English Language Teaching, read it, and then write your questions on the Facebook explaining the main themes of the decade, your response in relation to your teaching context. And then also not to forget reading the most famous book in the world. You see, I'm saying this on my YouTube channel to the hundreds and thousands of people that this is, in my opinion, I should say, in my opinion, the most famous book in the English language teaching world. That is written by Graham Hall, Exploring English Language Teaching, right? So read this chapter number 5, and then you can always find me on Facebook and YouTube with your comments. And if you already are there, you need to write your questions and comments in that session of the book. Before I conclude, I would like to share with you if I could share with you these books. I mean, this is very important that I should show you also, because I already had shared with you, and now I should share with you again. Okay, so if there are any questions, let us take your questions before I keep on sharing with you the books. Okay, this is the book that I am talking about, The Practice of English Teaching by J. Harmer. This is also a very important reading of the book for you in this course. And then another book that we'll be very largely referring to is
Hello, sir. I have a question.
Yes. This
So,
is
what is the role of uh, just
yes.
so? What is the role of method communicative competence in this teaching exploring system of method techniques? Because everything has their own definition. So, it is helpful in a communicative way.
Can you rephrase your question, please?
So, the basic question is that what is the role of method communicative competence?
What is the role of method?
Yes, sir. Method communicative competence.
I'm sorry, I'm still not able to make sense of your question. You are trying to, yes.
So, what is the role of method communicative competence?
Uh, well, I'm surprised to listen this phrase first time. Communicative competence is a phrase. It's not a method.
So, it is being helpful in a teaching English method. So, I will give it a reference when I go for something as a helpful.
Look, we have David Bombay, who is a very famous linguist in the late 20th century. He actually talked about two levels of competence.
Yes,
One
sir.
was linguistic competence, the other one was communicative competence. He thought that the language should be taught keeping in mind these two levels of competence. One is
Yes, sir.
communicative competence, which I
Yes, sir.
explained meant to focus on the use of communication skills only. The other was the linguistic competence, which was uh, intended to enable the students to learn about the production, about the making of language, and how different dimensions of language, from morphological, lexical, syntactical, and semantic, and uh, or notional orientations put together, and making the students linguistically competent to say something or speak about language. So these are two different things.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
So this is another book that we also I shared with you, Exploring English Language Teaching, Language in Action. And this, I said, is the most famous book now. I mean, this book includes not only teaching practices around the world, but it will tell you all what research informs us about these particular methods and particular practices, and the issues and challenges that English language learners are facing around the world, and what are the possible solutions for that. To me, I really love this book, and I would like all of you to refer to this book. Another book that I would like to share with you is Longman's Dictionary of Applied Linguistics. If you remember, I keep on telling you that this is really an amazing book to guide you into concepts, and yes, uh, this one. Now, this book uh, by Jake Richards and Schmidt, this is the most valid, the most authenticated book I have seen in my history, in my own career. A wonderful book that provides you the best definitions, brief and simple and clear explanation of various concepts in applied linguistics and English language teaching world. So, I mean, these three books are, you can consider them as your primary readings, should be part of your library or on your table and your daily reference, and will be helping you through this course a lot once we move into other courses in this uh, program. Okay, so is there any more questions?
Yes, sir. I have a question. Hello.
Yes, is there any question?
Sir. Yes, sir. I have a question. This is me, Sarfraz Ali.
Yes,
Sir,
please.
Sir, as we know, there have been many methods in language teaching introduced by many linguists all over the world. Uh, in their era, the adaptation of methods in language teaching is intended to solve the language teaching problems. Undoubtedly, one result of this trend was the era so-called the designer of brand name methods. That is the package solutions I know, and that can be described and marketed everywhere in the world. Sir, in nutshell, would you highlight and shed light on post-method era, and how do you see that if we get any kind of new method in this era, would it be implemented and beneficial for the students and youth of Pakistan, particularly, and all over the world?
Well, uh, that's a very important question, my dear. But in my opinion, the role of technology is going to be very critical and very defining in coming days in the teaching of language. Now, if you see the history, it tells us about contextualizing, learning language through contextualization, learning language through use, learning language through behavior, learning language on the model of L1, learning language through interaction, through role plays, learning language through activities and tasks and many other things. Now, the challenging part of the current story is that, current picture is that, how are we going to meet those challenges with this living in this post COVID-19 world, which is going to be the age of technology, the online education, and all that. So, what I really cannot answer this question at the moment. Can really take it as a food for my thought. What would be the new best method of teaching language if we are not back to those face-to-face classrooms as we used to be? However, I think the role of technology is going to be very, very crucial in all phases of our learning, in all disciplines of learning, in all uh, courses that we are going to learn in coming days. So we'll see what the ELT world is going to tell us. We'll keep reading research journals, research articles, but I definitely cannot rule out the role of technology. It's going to be more massive, more extensive. Those students, you might join language labs, like online language learning programs where we got language labs, where you have more or less a pseudo real situation of a classroom where you can just say something, the teachers would say something, the peers would say something, but at the moment we are just waiting for something good to happen. Next question.
Sir, so last but not least, I have a comment and as well as a demand, and that in the light of four methods, how do you see the post-method era?
I told you that in the post method era, there was one uh, one concept or one impression that the methods have not brought the desired goals of language teaching, so we should end them and we should give the freedom to the teacher, uh, putting all the responsibility on the shoulders of a teacher, giving him all the autonomy that he needs, giving learners all the autonomy that they need, and giving the curriculum designers the autonomy, and then leaving them to do the best in the classroom. And it was the classroom and the context to decide and design what and how the needs of the learners could be met with. So in this post-method era, this was actually the perception and people following the practices as they desired. But for the last few years, I have myself begin to realize, once I read research articles, once I read and listen to, I also listen to the great linguists around the world, everybody is beginning now to talk about a new method of language teaching. So might be we see something, as I said, coming up in next few years, a new method of teaching language. But I said in this new method of teaching language, technology will be central.
Thank you so much.
Next question. Anybody has got a question before I close it?
Yes, sir. Hello. Hello.
I think I'm not receiving any questions, but I'll be leaving my note that everybody who would like to ask a question, give a comment and suggestion, go to the YouTube channel and then write your questions and comments there. And I'll be trying to answer your questions and comments there. So I wish to see you again. I hope that everybody has got a handout on my next topic, which is the teaching of listening, theory and practice. We'll be meeting again on this new topic, another topic, which is the teaching of listening, theory and practice. And the time for this would be day after tomorrow, which is Thursday, 11 o'clock. And we'll be meeting on Thursday, 11 o'clock. Till then, take care of yourself. Keep reading the books that I shared with you, and then sharing with me your questions and comments on the Facebook or on the YouTube. I wish you good luck. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you so much.